So when you open your textbooks, your free textbooks, you scroll all the way down to page 152. The textbooks provides an example of a proposal, and you can use this as a guide. You can use the same headings, change your own title. I'll accept that. And you can use the same format. But I'm going to attach another example given consent from last year's students. Some of you know her. Her name is Chanel Johnson, and she's very good. She gave me permission to use her proposal as example for you, and I'm going to upload that after class. So you can either use this format, or you can look at Chanel's proposal and see what she did. She got a perfect or a near perfect score. Her score was the highest, so I used it as an example. So the research proposal, as we scroll down, can be several pages. And as you scroll down from 152 until 158 or something, you probably realize that it's a combination of all the assignments you did for me for the entire semester. So I want you to look at your previous assignment very carefully and look at my comments very carefully. If you incorporate my comments from the previous assignment and copy and paste some of them, not all, into your research proposal, you will do quite well. So go look at your previous assignment very carefully. Yeah, scroll all the way down. You can see it's a combination of your previous assignment. You don't have to read anything from 159 onwards. You can just stop at 158. Are we clear? So let's go through the sections in this example. You can start from 152. Always have a title in your proposal, and the aims of the research is a summary of what you are trying to get at, what you plan to do, whether you plan to examine human or sexual trafficking using quantitative or qualitative techniques. You need to summarize that here. Whether you plan to study homelessness using GIS maps, using existing statistics from government sources, or using ethnographic methods, you need to state that in the aims of the research section. And because you haven't taken your CT training, you don't have to actually conduct a study. It's illegal for you to conduct a study now because you haven't taken your CT training. And you don't have enough understanding of research ethics or IRB. So you just write a proposal in this assignment and you state what you plan to do, what techniques you plan to use. Are we clear? And maybe you plan to examine the interconnections between sex ed or sex education and demonization of sex. You summarize that in the aims of the research section, and then in the next sentence you write what techniques you plan to use, whether you plan to use quantitative techniques or qualitative techniques. And you need to specifically state the technique you plan to use. You plan to draw statistics from government sources, or you plan to do in-depth interview, or you plan to do focus groups when you examine interconnections between sex ed and demonization of sex. And if you plan to study the interrelationships between income inequality and educational inequality. You need to state that in your first sentence, like how this example is doing. You need to clearly state that in your first sentence. Then, in your second sentence or subsequent sentence, briefly state the technique you plan to use, so that the reader will have a very good idea of what to expect when they read your proposal. And this is very important, especially if you are writing an actual proposal in the future. If your role is project manager, project director, program manager, you will be expected to write proposals, sometimes to fund your own programs. So funders, they receive hundreds or thousands of proposals, and because of that, the first section is very, very important. So they are going to read, and they are very busy folks, the first section to see if this is worth reading forward or this is fundable. They are going to spend a few seconds or a few minutes, no more than that, reading the first section. So you have to state your goals very clearly, what you plan to do in your first section. Are we clear? And sometimes it's good to use the word explicitly or specifically, so that the funders, pretending this is an actual proposal, have a very clear idea of what you plan to do, and have a very, very good idea that you are not replicating studies that have already been funded or studies that have been already conducted. They don't want to fund studies that are replications of existing research, because resources are always limited. Are we clear? So the second section is the background of the research. You can pretend to say that you work for an agency, or you can make up an agency. Or if you don't have an agency, you don't want to go this route. You don't want to make up an agency. You don't want to pretend that you work for an existing agency or an existing non-profit. In your background to the research, you can also state that why it's important to study human or sex trafficking. Why it's important to study the interconnections between income inequality and education inequality. Even though many people have studied these connections, income and education inequality. But you have to clearly state in the background to research, you are bringing a whole new technique or a whole new perspective. You have to clearly state that in the background to research section. Are we clear? And you can say there are some or several limitations associated with quantitative analysis of homeless people, depending on the government policy of the state. They can be underrepresented or overrepresented, underreported or overreported. And maybe to fill in the gaps, you are going to use a qualitative techniques to understand homeless people in, let's say, Omaha. Maybe no studies on homelessness have been conducted in Omaha. So that's your new contribution. And in your background to research section, you talk about why understanding homelessness continues to be an important topic. And maybe from your literature review, you found that there are tons of studies that focus solely on sex education or health education. And there are also numerous studies that focus only on demonization of sex. But no studies combine the two. But is important based on your own understanding. After you read literatures on two sides and based on your own understanding, you think it's important to combine the two literatures into a very important research agenda. You need to clearly state that in the background to research section. Are we clear? Maybe you found a lot of studies, a lot of literatures articles out there that focus only on health ed or sex ed, and maybe very few articles that talks about demonization of sex, and you see connections between the two, but no researchers have combined the two in their study yet. So this would be your new contribution to the field, new and very important contribution to the field, right? You need to clearly state that in the background to research section to let your audience know. Or if you are writing a proposal to be funded in your future work roles, oh, you need to convince the funder that this project is fundable. We should look at these two concepts in conjunction. It's very important. And maybe if sex ed are conducted properly, there may be fewer cases of demonization of sex. And this is very important to know. You got to state that in the background to research section. Are we clear? Question? So what can you do in your background section? Do you remember what I just said? You can make up your own agency, right? Be idealistic and make up your own non-profit agency. Or you can pretend that you work in an existing government or non-profit agency. Or you can convince people why your topic is very important. Or you can do a combination of all three. They are not mutually exclusive. Are we clear? Okay. That is why I have you rewrite your literature review many times. I want you to get it right. And in this assignment, you're only required to give me 3 articles. Or 1 article, 2 book chapters, or 1 book, 2 articles. You need to give me 3 credible sources. And YouTube videos, blogs, or vlogs are not credible sources. Wikipedia is not credible source. It's not a credible source. If this is an actual proposal to be funded, if funders see you cited a blog, a YouTube channel, unless this is a very eclectic topic, if the funding agency sees you cited somebody's blog and that person don't even provide proper reference section, that person just merely talk about his or her opinions, no references provided in the blog, this project will not be funded. The same thing for YouTube. Unless your topic is so eclectic that no one has studied the topic before. It's not the case in this class. Maybe people have focused on one topic entirely, and many studies have focused on another topic, but you see the value in combining the 2 topics. So it's not an eclectic topic in this case. You see the value of combining 2 literatures. Are we clear? So, if funder sees that you write your lit review like an annotated bibliography, it will not be funded. That is why I want you to follow your ex-classmate's example, or I want you to listen to my video again very carefully. So, if you have a very high score for your literature review assignment, your second last assignment, you can just copy and paste. But if you copy your annotated bibliography here, you will lose points for the whole section. And if you cite blogs or YouTube channels or Wikipedia in this section, you will not score any points. Be careful. That is why I keep extending your deadline in your exercise 4, because literature review is very important. I have another video, right, of some people who make a living merely writing literature review. And if you decide within yourself, yeah, I'm a social major, right, and I'm not too inclined to take more statistics courses, the one I had in the stats department or in the psych department is sufficient for me. Or I don't want to clean data, but I'm an organized person, and eventually I may want a supervisory role. I'm quite organized. I think I work well with different people in an organization. I can serve as a bridge, as a liaison to different people or different entities within a company, an organization, a non-profit. So one way is to shoot for program manager role, supervisory role, like I show you in another video. If that's the case, usually the program manager, project director, project coordinator are in charge of writing the literature review, and the aim section, the first section, or the background section. The program manager may not be a stats whiz or somebody who is good in programming to clean the data, may not know everything about IT, that's fine, but he or she can coordinate the task well. So one way to coordinate the task well is to make sure that the proposal is coherent, all the sections tie together. So these are all the sections written by the program manager or closely monitored by the program manager. Sometimes program manager may manage multiple projects. The person may delegate writing the aims of the proposal, the background of the proposal, or the lead review of the proposal to an employee, but he or she closely work with that employee to make sure that everything ties together. Are we clear? So you got to fix your exercise 4. And after that, you state your research problem. And for your research problem, you can again, in a different wording, state why is this an important topic? Why should we study the interconnections between health education and demonization of sex? Why focus on these two topics separately is insufficient to solve the current problems, whatever they are. You know more in your area than me. I'm not an expert in gender and sexuality. I haven't taken a course with Dr. Lockring. And you got to say that why it's important to study homelessness, maybe in Omaha. Maybe economy has gotten more and more volatile as years go by, and this may increase in homeless population. And maybe gun violence. Many people have studied gun violence, but it's not a saturated topic yet, even though tons and tons of research have been published on gun violence. So you got to convince the audience, or more importantly, the funders. Why, even though hundreds of work have been published on gun violence, and you still want to study gun violence? How has the context of gun violence changed over time? You state that in your research problem section. Columbine was 2 decades ago, right? So the time and context of crime, they change over time. We know that. Let's go off a tangent for a while. Remember the Salem witches trial? You learned that in history, right? Famous historical incident, right? Do you think those ladies were actually witches? Or they were being framed? It's hard to know, right? So, from a sociological perspective, any of your professors talk about Salem trial? Okay, what did he say? He or she?
It was like, I don't remember, it was a while ago, but we read a book about it,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just about how people like accused them, like for like they accused them like really like quick. Like it didn't take much to accuse someone of like if they didn't like them, they would use that like they would be like, oh well, she's a witch, she's doing this to our family, even if she wasn't really doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I remember.
Maybe the Puritans, they just came to this country, and at that time there were many infectious diseases, smallpox, maybe tribal wars among Indians and with the Indians. So things were very unstable back then, hundreds of years ago. So some sociologists, when they analyze this incident from sociological perspective, they say that the ministers, not to offend anybody here, when they want to solidify their position in Salem County that time, they want everybody to have the same religion to maintain stability in that colony. So when these women, they were somewhat different. They were being labeled as what? Deviant, right? Deviants. Or sometimes criminal, even worse. But if this incident were to repeat today, is it okay for people to be witches, to claim that they are witches? Yeah, people do that, right? You see on internet, on websites, on YouTube, right? People have channels saying that they are witches, and how they go about their lives, right, is okay. So this tells us what? The nature of crime can change over time and context, right? So if the incidents were to repeat today, who would be the criminals or the deviants? Do people still practice public hanging today?
No.
So who would be the deviants? Who would be the weird people to this today if these incidents happen today? The minister, right? And the witches, quote unquote witches, who cares? They may just be one subculture in any given society, right? So it's the same thing for crime and deviance. Maybe the nature of school shootings changed over time and context. Columbine, even though it was still famous, it was still widely talked about, right? But maybe how school shooting happens recently, if you follow the news very carefully, you follow the narratives, the interviews, you can see that the nature of crime changed. So you got to state that clearly in your research problem section if you want to focus on gun violence, even though it's a legacy topic, but you got to convince your funders, your audience in this section that I still want to study this topic because the nature of gun violence may have changed in the 90s and now. And you need to briefly talk about how the 90s are different from the 21st century. Are we clear? Okay. Your research question, you need to read my comments very carefully. You had a research question assignment, right? And hypothesis. So you need to incorporate my comments into your proposal in this section called research question. And if you did not come up with research questions pertaining to your topic, you need to start now. If you did come up with research questions pertaining to your topic, you need to see if I make any comments, I corrected anything, and then copy and paste here. Are we clear? So nothing is new. And you don't have to have 7 research questions, but the minimum is 3. 3 to 5 is sufficient. And if you plan to do a quantitative studies, you may also need to have a hypothesis section. Are we clear? You also wrote your hypothesis, right? Some of you in that assignment. Okay. Then in your methodology section, you talk about whether you plan to use quantitative study or qualitative study to do your research, and why that technique is appropriate. Are we clear? And you briefly talk about maybe a ton of studies examining the interconnections between income inequality and educational inequality, but using quantitative techniques, advanced statistical methods, and econometric methods. And what are the limitations of quantitative studies in this regard? You need to think through. And then maybe you say, I plan to use qualitative techniques for this. Not much people have used qualitative techniques to study the interconnections between income inequality and educational inequality. And that's where I'm going to fill in the gaps. I plan to use qualitative techniques. And maybe existing research that use quantitative techniques to examine income and educational inequality, they focus on maybe education or income data obtained from the census or the famous Gini coefficients. And you don't know the processes if they do it this way. They focus on measures from the census, or they use the famous Gini coefficients. They calculate all these measures from the census. They create a new index called a Gini coefficient. It's a famous measure for inequality. But you realize no studies have used qualitative techniques, have attempted to understand the processes that led income inequality to eventually educational inequality, the processes that contribute to income inequality and years later contribute to educational inequality. And maybe there's a lack of studies that focus on people's comparison with their immediate family members, their neighbors, or their friends when they talk about or when they perceive the concept of inequality, be it income or education. No people approach this topic from this angle. So maybe that's why a qualitative technique is very important here. Are we clear? Because from what I read so far, studies that examine interconnections between income and education inequality, they all use government data. They are all being done by economists. They use advanced statistical techniques. They use data from the census. Nothing wrong with that. But because of that, they all almost focus only on one perspective. Or they use the famous Gini index and another perspective. And nobody look at inequality, be it education or income, in a comparative sense. They compare themselves to their neighbors in terms of the homes they live, the cars they drive, in terms of where the kids go to school, in terms of what grocery they buy, if they talk to their family members or the neighbors. And they get a comparative sense of inequality. Oh, I'm not as well off as my neighbor. So this is where qualitative research can fill in the gaps. Are we clear? The same thing for homelessness. We know existing statistics, they are either overrepresented or underrepresented. So you need to state what's the appropriate methodology to overcome existing limitations in the research you found. Are we clear? The same thing for sex trafficking data. When I took you to the lab, we talk about the data. It doesn't make sense. California has no data on sex trafficking. It doesn't make sense. Maybe it wasn't the priority for law enforcement in California. It cannot be that they don't have any reported cases. The same thing for Nebraska and Iowa. So you talk about the limitations of quantitative study on sexual trafficking or human trafficking, and how maybe qualitative studies, maybe interviewing the perpetrators in prison or interviewing the victims in shelter can help fill in the gaps. Are we clear? Questions so far? So talk about the techniques you plan to use and talk about why that technique is appropriate for your topic. 2 things. Are we clear? I know I'm long-winded, but I want everybody to do well. And no study is perfect, okay? Nobody has perfect data, I'm sorry. So you got to acknowledge your limitations. And for sex trafficking, even if you do qualitative studies, are you going to have a perfect research if you do qualitative studies? No. Yeah, right, no. You are shaking your heads. So, even if your project is funded and you went and interviewed perpetrators in prison, can you interview all the perpetrators in all prisons in the entire US? Can you? No. We are always under a time and budget constraint when we do research. And by the time we interview or we do in-depth interview or focus groups with all perpetrators, how long it's going to take, do you know? If we interview every perpetrators in every prison in the US.
A long time.
Do you think 5 years is enough?
No.
More than that? 10 years? Is that enough?
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Would you have more than one interviewer or just one person interviewing?
Let's say you hire a few interviewers with a grant, graduate students, or even with 10 interviewers, how long is it going to take?
Oh, I have no idea. Way too long.
More than 5 years, more than 10 years.
Probably.
And by the time you collect all your data, maybe the context of that crime changed.
Yeah.
Like the shootings, the school shootings. It's not accurate anymore, your results. So, for sex trafficking, that's one important limitation. You can only focus on one particular prison in one particular location. You need to acknowledge that in your limitations research. And potential outcomes, you say that you will foresee or you will expect the perpetrators to talk about what events in their childhood, in their teenage years, or in their young adulthood years that led them to become perpetrators. of sex trafficking to commit this kind of crime, or how their family upbringing led them to commit this kind of crime, sex trafficking in this case, to the point that they left scars in innocent people's life. You've got to talk about your potential outcomes. And if you are interested in gun violence, maybe you interview victims of gun violence. Maybe you interview a school. You got permission to do research on the school. You interview the principal or administrators from their perspective on how to prevent this incident again. Then you interview the teachers on their perspectives. Teachers may bring in a different perspective because they spend way more time in the classroom than administrators in any school, we all know. And then you interview fellow students, and yet you are going to gain yet a new perspective. And your potential outcomes by interviewing fellow students would be, students will talk about how much they knew the perpetrators, or how much they knew the victims, what are their personalities like, and maybe some fellow classmates may know how's their upbringing. And maybe you expect students may also talk about whether the perpetrators mingle a lot with their classmates. And when you can also state in this section, when you interview administrators or principals, we are going to expect them to talk about how to prevent this incident in the future, what programs, policies they have in mind for the school to prevent this incident in the near future. How would they improve their fire drills? Not fire drills, their drills for shootings. I'm sorry. And if you interview teachers, they may be somewhat like the students. Teachers may talk about how much they know about the perpetrators. That's what you expect to see if you actually conduct the study. This is what you write in this section. You have to talk about potential outcomes, and then you got to acknowledge your limitations. Sorry, I'm jumping around. Let's go to sex trafficking again. So if Destiny were to conduct interview with perpetrators in the prison, let's say if she got a somewhat big grant that allows her to interview perpetrators in 3 different prisons, in 3 different states, in 3 different locations, can she find consistencies among her narratives? If Destiny got a big grant to interview perpetrators of sex trafficking in 3 different states, in 3 different prisons, can she find any consistencies in her narratives among prisoners? Or their narratives may go into different directions, and it may be quite challenging to group them into different teams. If she do qualitative studies with lots of open-ended questions, and if she wants to do her study this way, in-depth interview, and her questions are somewhat unstructured or semi-structured, she went with the flow, is she going to strike consistencies among the results she got from 3 prisons?
Probably not.
Very hard. Rarely, right?
Yeah.
People may go into all different directions, the prisoners who were sex traffickers in the past. So this is one of her limitations. Her study, even though it's a very good study, very important topic, very beneficial to society, but her study is going to be low in reliability. Remember, this study on sex trafficking is going to be low in reliability, and she got to acknowledge that in this section. All your studies have limitations, especially if you do qualitative studies. Are we clear? If you don't write anything in this section, or you just write 1 or 2 sentences, I will not give you any points. you got to acknowledge your limitations. So Destiny is going to acknowledge the limitation, saying that, yeah, because my interview questions are open-ended and some of them are semi-structured, or I also plan to use unstructured interview. I plan to go with the flow. Let the prisoners elaborate on events, the processes that led them to become sex traffickers in the past. So, my study will be low in reliability. It's hard for me to find consistencies among the results of my 3 studies in 3 different prisons. She got to acknowledge her limitations. The same thing for Olivia's study. The interconnections between sex act and demonization of sex. Or maybe, to frame it differently, the potential roles of sex act in minimizing the problem associated with demonization of sex. And I bet there are very few quantitative studies or statistical analysis on this topic. My gauge is that there may be tons and tons of statistical analysis on health education or sex education, but they don't tie this health ed or sex ed studies to demonization of sex. Are we clear? And I think for this topic, she may have to resort to qualitative techniques, or she can use close-ended, I take that back. She can combine 2 techniques, but she will not find any existing surveys on the connections between these 2. She will have to conduct her own survey if she got a grant. And she can combine close-ended and open-ended survey questions. We know close-ended survey questions, you can calculate the frequencies, you can calculate the percentages, right, in each category of responses. So she will have to do primary data collection. It's very hard for her to find existing data, or we call that secondary data. She will have to do primary data collection. And she can combine quantitative and qualitative techniques. So she's going to state that in this section, if you want to study the potential of sex ed in minimizing the problems associated with demonization of sex in the future, she will have to justify that in the methodology section on why combining a quantitative study and a qualitative study in this topic is very beneficial. And she's going to have another sentence or 2 justifying why she has to collect her own data. Are we clear? And the same thing for homelessness. Remember different studies on homelessness? We've been through these examples, right? Studies conducted by Dr. Borchert focus on the meaning people bring to homelessness in Vegas, and studies conducted in Lower Manhattan. From all these narratives the researchers found in Lower Manhattan, they found apparently even though people are homeless, they cannot afford to pay rent or mortgage. That's why they live on the streets. But there are certain decorums that exist in the street culture. There are certain informal social control among homeless people in Lower Manhattan. But maybe Dr. Borchert did not find that out when he interviewed the homeless people in his 2 books. So we did not find any consistencies if we read the 2 books on homelessness. So the same thing for the study on sex trafficking. So because of that, many qualitative studies are low in reliability. They are high in validity because there's no one size fits all questionnaire, a set questionnaire with a set options where people just check things off. When that's the case, we can strike consistencies. If Destiny were to use closed-ended questionnaire in 3 different prisons, her study will be high in reliability but low in validity. That's another limitations. If she plans to use quantitative study, statistical analysis to study sex trafficking, if she interviewed prisoners in 3 different prisons using just closed-ended survey questions, she's not going to know what processes, how the family upbringing, what events that led these prisoners to become sex traffickers. There's always limitations, whether you use quantitative or qualitative techniques. Are we clear? So you got to fully acknowledge that in this section. And you don't have to do this part, outline program for work. You can skip this. Are we clear? Okay, I'm done. Any questions so far? I'm done.